Welcome to the Great Basin Seasonal Outlook for December through March. Over the last 30 days, we've seen warmer than normal temperatures over the eastern half of the Great Basin and near or cooler than normal temperatures over much of Nevada. Precipitation has been pretty spotty and mostly focused over the eastern half to two-thirds of the Great Basin, with still most areas seeing below normal precipitation, but there are certainly some pockets over the last month over southern Idaho into eastern Nevada and parts of Utah that have seen above normal precipitation. Very dry conditions have continued over southern Nevada and parts of western Nevada and over parts of central Idaho into Wyoming. Since the beginning of the water year, October 1st, 2023, we've seen again minimal precipitation across much of the Great Basin, so still generally well below normal precipitation over the southern half of the region and near to above normal precipitation in some spots over the northern half of the area. But still over central Idaho, precipitation's been below normal in the mountains as well as down into the Sierra. So looking at fuel moisture, all fuel moisture really is in a state of dormancy or transitioning into dormancy in the far south, but again in most areas not really a factor for this time of year as fuel moistures will continue to again transition into dormancy. The drought conditions across the Great Basin, we really have no drought conditions in most of the Great Basin. The only exceptions are far eastern Utah, where we are seeing some moderate drought still, although conditions have improved, and over parts of southern Nevada and the Arizona Strip, and parts of southern Utah, where we're seeing abnormally dry conditions. But again, in most areas, really no drought, and no big changes to the drought are expected here over the next few months. We will likely see the drought persist near the Colorado border, but otherwise I don't really anticipate any drought development in the next few months. So kind of putting everything together from the past, and now we'll look into the future a little bit, looking at La Nina and El Nino. We have transitioned into a state of El Nino, which is where ocean temperatures off the coast of Central America and the equatorial Pacific are warmer than normal. So again, that's what classifies us into El Nino, which is a stark change from the last several years where we've seen 3 years of La Nina conditions with those cooler waters. So looking ahead, these are all different forecasts going forward, and El Nino will likely stick around through the winter months into the spring, and then we could see some cooling in transitioning to more normal conditions sometime during the fire season. And so what kind of effects does this have on our weather? Typically, we see most of the effects from El Nino or La Nina in the wintertime, usually later in December going through January and February. And the conditions that are associated most typically with El Nino are wetter conditions over far southern areas of the Great Basin and warmer and drier conditions over northern areas. We haven't quite seen that pattern emerge yet, but now that we're getting into early December, we'll likely see that shift of the precipitation and possibly more of a focus down south as we get later in the year or going into the January-February time period. Again, this is what our typical El Nino pattern would look like. So looking at our precipitation over the last 1 to 2 weeks, again, we haven't really seen much of that. We've been kind of dry in most areas, but storms have been tracking across the Great Basin, bringing precipitation to parts of southern Idaho into mainly Utah. Again, over the last couple weeks, very dry in central Idaho and southern Nevada. However, looking forward over the next week, going into the first week of December, we are expecting storm systems to move across the northern tier of the Great Basin and again bring that really good amounts of precipitation to parts of central Idaho that have kind of been in a deficit, and also, as you can see, to coastal areas of the Pacific Northwest. So again, not quite the El Nino pattern emerging yet, but we'll be watching for that later in the year, more towards the January-February timeframe. So currently our snowpack, with the really conditions not seeing significant amounts of precipitation in most areas, our snowpack is generally below normal for the time of year, really across the Great Basin, just with some pockets of areas near normal. And this is really true across much of the West. Looking at the 8 to 14 day outlook, taking us from December 9th through the 15th, so into the second week of December, generally showing near normal temperatures and still that wetter pattern over the northern half of the Great Basin going through the middle of the month. Although we may see some precipitation kind of come around and drop into the Four Corners area as well. So southern Utah could get into some of that above normal precipitation, but really southern Nevada, southern California, western Arizona remaining on the drier side. Looking over the next few months, what to expect going through March. So again, December, probably later in the month, is where we may start to see this above normal precipitation start to emerge over southern areas of the Great Basin into Southern California, but probably more so January into February and possibly lingering into March. So again, we are expecting areas up north for Idaho to see mainly either near or below normal precipitation, especially as we get into that later in January, February, March timeframe, and a shift to more of a southern track of the storm systems. So we'll be watching to see if this emerges and to see how our winter precipitation and snowpack change. So putting everything together, obviously we're not expecting any super dry conditions, so no real impacts to fire potential, generally normal conditions, which would be low fire potential and fire activity for the Great Basin through March. There will be some areas that could perk up at times if we do see prolonged dry periods in areas where we have above normal fine fuel loading, so parts of the Snake River Plain, parts of northern Nevada, maybe even parts of northern and eastern Utah could see some fire potential pick up if we see prolonged dry conditions in the grass areas and if we see very strong wind events. So aside from that, generally low fire potential. That concludes our webcast for this seasonal outlook for December through March. Check back in early January for the next seasonal outlook.